My story is one of many thousands, and the world will suffer if it ends too soon. Your brother, Ezio Auditore da Firenze. Al-Scarab, in the course of fitting out for his own new ventures, had also seen to it that Ezio had the attention of the best doctors, the best tailors, the best chefs, and the best women Acre could provide. His blades were honed and sharpened, his kit was fully cleaned, repaired, replaced where necessary, and thoroughly overhauled. As the day approached for Ezio to leave, Al-Scarab presented him with 2 fine horses. "A present from my uncle, he breeds them, but I don't have much use for them in my trade." Tough little Arabs with soft leather tack and 1 fine, high-ended, tooled saddle. Ezio continued to refuse any escort, but accepted supplies for his journey, which from now on would carry him overland, through what had once, long ago, been the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. And now the time of parting had come, the last leg in a long journey, and whether it would be completed or not, Ezio had no way of telling. But for him there was only the journey. It had to be made. Old men ought to be explorers. At its end, he would see. "Go with your God, Ezio." "Barakallah fik, my friend," Ezio replied, taking the big pirate's hand. "We'll meet again." "Yes." Both men wondered in their hearts if they were telling the truth, but the words comforted them. It didn't matter. They looked each other in the eye and knew that in their different ways they were part of the same fellowship. Ezio mounted the larger of the 2 horses, the bay, and turned her head around. Without a backward glance, he headed out of the city, north. 9. Masyaf was 200 miles as the crow flies away from Acre. The seemingly gentle desert land that lay between the 2 points was very far from gentle in fact. The great Ottoman outward thrust from its original core had been going on relentlessly for 200 years, and had culminated in the taking of Constantinople by the 20-year-old Sultan Mehmed II in 1453. But still the Turkish tentacles extended, reaching westward as far as Bulgaria and beyond, and south and east into Syria and what had once been the Holy Land. The eastern coastal strip of the White Sea, with its vital ports and its access by water westward, was a jewel in the crown, and the Ottoman grip on it was as yet fragile. Ezio was under no illusions about what battles he would have to face as he made his lonely way north. He followed the coast for most of the way, keeping the sparkling sea in view to his left, riding the high cliffs and the tattered scrublands that topped them, travelling in the hours of dawn and dusk, hiding for 4 hours when the sun was at its highest, and resting again for 4 hours at night under the stars. Travelling alone had its advantages. He could blend in far more easily than would have been possible if he'd had an escort, and his keen eyes discerned danger points ahead well enough in advance either to skirt them or wait until they had passed. This was bandit country, where half-disciplined gangs of unemployed mercenaries roamed, killing travellers and each other for what they could get, surviving, as it seemed to Ezio, merely for the sake of it, in a countryside still reeling in the aftermath of centuries of war. Men turned feral and no longer thinking, no longer hoping or fearing, men who had lost any sense of conscience, ruthless and reckless, and as callous as they were remorseless. Fights there were, when they could not be avoided, and every one of them pointless, leaving a few more dead for the vultures and the crows, which were the only creatures truly to thrive in this wasteland, forgotten of God. Once Ezio saved a frightened village from marauders, and once a woman from torture, rape, and death. But for how long, and what would become of them after he had passed by? He was not God, he could not be everywhere, and here, where once Christ had trodden, God showed no evidence of looking after his own. The farther north he rode, the heavier Ezio's heart became. Only the fire of the quest kept him on the path. But he tied brushwood to his horses' tails to eradicate his tracks as he passed, and at night he spread branches of thorn to rest on, so that he would never quite sleep. Eternal vigilance was not only the price of freedom, but of survival. Though the passing years might have robbed him of some of his strength, that was compensated for by experience, and the fruit of the training which had been drummed into him by Paola and Mario so long ago in Florence and Monteriggioni had never rotted. Though Ezio sometimes felt that he couldn't go on, that he wouldn't go on, he went on. 200 miles as the crow flies, but this was a harsh winter, and there were many detours and delays along the road. Finally, Ezio saw the mountains rearing ahead of him. He drew in a deep breath of cold air. Masyaf was near. 3 weeks later, on foot, both horses dead in the frozen passes behind him, and on his conscience, for they had been more stalwart and loyal companions than many men, Ezio stood in sight of his goal. An eagle soared high in the hard, clear sky. Ezio, battered from the road, drew his eyes from it, pulled himself up and over a low, rough wall, and stood motionless for a moment, scanning the scene with keen eyes. Masyaf, after many weary months on the journey, and such a long journey, the ways deep and the weather sharp. Crouching just in case, and keeping still as he instinctively checked his weapons, Ezio kept watching. Any sign of movement? Any. Not a soul on the battlements. Scuds of snow twisting in a cutting wind, but no sign of a man. The place seemed deserted, as he'd expected from what he'd read of it, but life had taught him that it was always best to make sure. He stayed still. Not a sound but the wind. Then something. A scraping? To his left, ahead of him, a handful of pebbles skittered down a bare incline. He tensed, rose slightly, head up between ducked shoulders. Then the arrow, coming from nowhere, whacked into his right shoulder, through the body armor there. 10. The dawn was cold and grey. In its stillness, Ezio roused himself from his memories and snapped all his concentration to the present, as he heard the footfall of guards' boots on the flagstones of the castle approaching his cell. This was the moment. He'd pretend to be weak, and that wasn't too hard a thing to do. He was thirstier than he'd been in a long time, and hungrier, but the beaker and the food still stood untouched on the table. He'd lay on the floor face down, his hood pulled low over his face. He heard the door of his cell crash open, and the men came in. They reached under his shoulders and half-lifted him, dragging him out, and along the bare, grey stone corridor outside. Looking down at the floor as he was dragged over it, Ezio saw, marked on it, laid out in a darker stone, the great symbol of the assassins, their insignia since time immemorial. The corridor gave way at length to a wider space, a kind of hall, open on one side. Ezio felt keen, fresh air on his face, and it revived him. He raised his head slightly and saw that beyond him there were tall openings demarcated by narrow columns, and beyond them a wide-open view of the pitiless mountains. They were still high in the tower. They pulled him to his feet, and he shook himself free of them. They stood back slightly, halberds at the ready, lowered but pointing at him. Facing him, his back to the void, stood the captain of the day before. He held a noose in his hand. "You are a tenacious man, Ezio," the captain said, "to come all this way for a glimpse inside Altaïr's castle. It shows heart." He gestured to his men to stand farther back, leaving Ezio standing alone. Then he went on, "But you're an old hound now. Better to put you out of your misery than see you whimper to a sad end." Ezio turned slightly to address the man directly. That tiny movement, he noted to his satisfaction, was enough to make the halberdiers flinch and steady their weapons on him. "Any last words before I kill you?" Ezio said. The captain was made of sterner stuff than his men. He stood firm. He laughed. "I wonder how long it will take for the buzzards to pick your bones clean, as your body dangles from these parapets." There's an eagle up there somewhere. He'll keep the buzzards away. A lot of good that'll do you. Come forward. Or are you afraid to die? You wouldn't want to have to be dragged to your death, would you? Ezio moved forward slowly, every sense taut. That's good, said the captain, and Ezio immediately sensed his slight relaxation. Did the man really think he was giving in? Was he that vain, that stupid? If so, all the better. But perhaps, after all, this ugly man who smelled of sweat and cooked meat was right. The moment of death had to come sometime. Beyond the wide window between the columns, a narrow wooden platform projected over the void, perhaps 10 feet long and 4 wide, constructed of 6 rough planks. It looked ancient and unsafe. The captain bowed in an ironic gesture of invitation. Ezio stepped forward again, waiting for his moment, but at the same time wondering if it would come. The planks creaked ominously under his weight, and the air was cold around him. He looked at the sky and the mountains. Then he saw the eagle coasting 50 or 100 feet below him, its white pinions spread, and somehow that gave him hope. Then something else happened. Ezio had noticed another similar platform projecting from the tower at the same level, some 15 feet to his right, and now, on it, alone, walking fearlessly forward, was the young, cowled man in white he had glimpsed in the battle. As Ezio watched, his breath suspended, the man seemed to be turning toward him, to be making the beginning of a gesture. And then, again, the vision faded, and there was nothing but the wind and the occasional scatter of gusting snow. Even the eagle had disappeared from sight. The captain approached, noose in hand. Ezio fleetingly noticed that there was plenty of slack in the rope that trailed behind it. "No eagle here that I can see," said the captain. "I wager it'll take the buzzards no more than 3 days." "I'll let you know," Ezio replied evenly. A knot of guards had come up behind the captain, but it was the captain himself, now standing close behind Ezio, who pulled down his hood, slipped the noose over his head, and pulled it tight around his neck. "Now," said the captain. Now. At the very moment that he felt Captain's hands on his shoulders, ready to shove him into oblivion, Ezio raised his right arm, crooked it, and drove his elbow violently backward. As the captain fell back with a cry, stumbling into his companions, Ezio stooped and took up the slack of the rope where it still lay on the planking, and, dodging between the 3 men, spun round and looped the slack round the stumbling captain's neck. Then he himself leapt from the platform into the void. The captain had tried to recoil, but too late. He was slammed to the planks under the impact of Ezio's weight as he fell, and the planks shuddered as his head struck them. The rope snapped taut, all but breaking the captain's neck as it did so. Turning blue, his hands went to his neck as he kicked and struggled against death. Uttering all the oaths they knew, the guards drew their swords and moved forward fast, hacking at the rope to free their officer. When the rope was cut, the accursed Ezio Auditore would plummet to his death on the rocks 500 feet below, and as long as he was dead, what did the manner of it matter? At the rope's end, twirling in space, Ezio already had both hands between the noose and his neck, straining to keep it from cutting into his windpipe. But as he did so, he was already scanning the scene below him. He was dangling close to the walls. There had to be something he could catch to break his fall. But if there wasn't, this was a better way to meet death than going to it meekly. Above, on the dangerously swaying platform, the guards at last succeeded in severing the rope, which by now was drawing blood from the captain's neck, and Ezio found himself falling. But at the moment he felt the rope go loose, he swung his body closer to the walls of the castle. Masyaf was built for assassins by assassins. It would not forsake him. And he had seen a piece of broken scaffolding projecting from the wall 50 feet below. He guided his body toward it as he plummeted downward. He caught it, wincing in pain as his arm was wrenched almost free of its socket. but the scaffolding held, and he held, and, grinding his teeth with effort, hauled himself up until he could get a grip with both hands. But it wasn't over yet. The guards above, leaning out, had seen what had happened, and began to lay hold of anything they could to throw down and dislodge him. Rocks and stones and jagged pieces of broken wood hailed on him. Ezio looked round desperately. Over to his left, an escarpment ran up to the wall, reaching it perhaps 20 feet away from where he was. If he could swing from the scaffolding and gain enough momentum to throw himself across that distance, there was a faint chance that he could roll down the escarpment, at the foot of which he could see the edge of a cliff-top, from which a crumbling stone bridge stretched over a chasm to where a narrow path clung to the side of the mountain opposite. Ducking under the rain of debris from above, Ezio started to swing backward and forward, his hands slipping on the ice-smooth wood of the scaffolding, but they held, and he soon built up impetus. The moment came when he felt he just couldn't hold on any more. He'd have to risk it, and he summoned all his energy into one last powerful backswing, hurling himself into space as his body moved forward again and spread-eagled himself in the air as he flew toward the escarpment. He landed heavily, badly, and it winded him. Before he had time to recover his balance, he was tumbling down the slope, bouncing off the rough ground, but gradually able to guide his battered body in the general direction of the bridge. He knew this was vital, for if he did not end at exactly the right spot, he would be hurled over the cliff's edge into God knew what void beneath. And he was going too fast. He had no control over his speed. But he kept his nerve somehow, and at last he was thrown to the ground, 10 feet onto the trembling bridge itself. A sudden thought struck him. How old was this bridge? It was narrow, single-span, and far, far below. Ezio could hear the crashing of angry water over the rocks, invisible in the depths of the black chasm beneath. The shock of his weight thrown upon it had shaken the bridge. How long was it since anyone had crossed it? Its stonework was already crumbling, weakened with age, its mortar rotted. And as he got to his feet, to his horror he saw a crack snap open right across its width, not 5 feet behind him. The crack soon widened, and the masonry on either side of it began to fall, tumbling crazily down into the dark abyss. As Ezio watched, time itself seemed to slow down. There was no longer any retreat. He realized immediately what was going to happen. Turning, he started to sprint, summoning every muscle in his straining body to this one last effort. Across the bridge to the other side he ran, the structure fracturing and plummeting behind him. 20 yards to go, 10. He could feel the stonework plunging away just as his heels left it. And at last, his chest practically splitting with the effort of breathing, he lay upright against the grey rock of the mountainside, his cheek pressed to it, his feet secure on the narrow path, unable to think or do anything, listening to the sounds of the stones of the bridge as they fell into the torrent below, listening to the sounds ebb and ebb, until there was nothing, no sound at all, but the wind. 11. Gradually, Ezio's breathing calmed and levelled, and the aches in his muscles, forgotten in the crisis, began to return. But there was much to do before he could allow his body the rest it needed. What he had to do was feed it. He hadn't eaten or drunk anything for nearly 24 hours. He bandaged his grazed hands as well as he could, using a scarf drawn from within his tunic and tearing it in two, and cupped a palm to capture a trickle of water that was running off the rock against which his cheek was pressed. Partly assuaged, he pushed away from the surface he'd been leaning on and checked himself over. No broken bones, a slight sprain in the left side where he'd been wounded, but nothing else, nothing serious. He surveyed the scene. No one seemed to have set out in pursuit, but they would have watched his fall down the escarpment and his run across the collapsing bridge. Perhaps they hadn't noticed that he'd made it. Perhaps they'd just assumed that he hadn't. But he couldn't discount the possibility that there'd be search parties out, if only to recover a body. The Templars would want to be quite sure that the mentor of their arch-enemies was indeed dead. He looked at the mountainside next to him. Better to climb than to use the path. He didn't know where it led, and it was too narrow to afford him room to maneuver if he had to fight, and the mountain looked climbable. At the very least, he might be able to reach some pockets of snow and really slake his thirst. He shook himself, grunting, and set about his task. He was glad that he was dressed in dark colours, for he had no need to make any effort to blend with the rock face he was crawling up. Handholds and footholds were easy to find at first, though there were times when he had to stretch hard, times when his muscles shrieked in protest, and once a shard of rock flaked off in his hand, nearly causing him to crash back down the 100 feet or so he'd already covered. The worst thing, and the best, was the thin but constant stream of water that fell on him from above. The worst because the wet rocks were slippery. The best because a waterfall meant a creek, at the very least a creek, up above. But half an hour's climb brought him to the top of what turned out to be not a mountain, but a cliff, since the ground he finally hauled himself up onto was level and covered with patches of rough, tussocky grass. A kind of all but barren alpine meadow, bordered on two sides by more walls of black and grey rock, but opening westward quite some way, as far as Ezio could see. A mountain pass, except for the fact that behind him it led nowhere. Perhaps once, long ago, it had. An ancient earthquake might well have caused the cliffs he'd just climbed, and the gully into which the bridge had fallen. Ezio sped to one side of the little valley to reconnoitre. Where there were passes, there was water. There would also be people. He waited, near motionless, for another half an hour before venturing forward, shaking his muscles to keep them warm as they had begun to stiffen with the long period of immobility. He was wet, he was getting cold. He could not afford to be out there for too long. It was one thing to escape the Templars, but his effort would be wasted if he now fell victim to nature. He moved closer to the stream, locating it by the chuckling of its water. Stooping by its bank, he drank as much as he dared without glutting himself. He followed on. A few woody shrubs began to appear by its banks, and soon he came upon a stunted coppice by the side of a pool. There he paused. It would be a miracle if there was anything living so high, so far from the village that squatted below the castle of Masyaf, any animal he could catch and eat. But if there was a pool, there was also the faintest chance that there might be fish. He knelt and peered into the depths of the dark water. Still as a fishing heron, he disciplined himself to be patient. And then at last a ripple, a faint one, which disappeared as soon as it had unsettled the water's surface, but enough to show him that there was something alive in there. He continued his watch. Little flies hovered low over the pool. Some flew over and harassed him, attracted to his body heat. Not daring to swat them away, he endured their tickling attentions and their tiny, vicious bites. Then he saw it, a large, plump body, the colour of a corpse, moving sluggishly 6 inches below the surface. Better than he'd dared hope. It looked like a carp, maybe, or something very like it. As he watched, another, much darker, joined it, and then a third, its scales coppery gold. Ezio waited for them to do what he expected them to do, put their snouts to the surface and gulp air. That would be his moment. All his attention focused, he tensed his body and steeled his hands. The dark fish made its move. Bubbles erupted as a fat mouth appeared. Ezio sprang, and fell back elated, the big fish wriggling frantically in his grasp, but unable to slide out. He laid it on the ground beside him and dispatched it with a stone. There was no way he could cook this. He'd have to eat it raw, but then he looked again at the stone he'd used to kill it and remembered the shard that had flaked off in his hand during his climb. Flint! With luck, he could start a fire, to dry his clothes as much as to cook with. Raw fish didn't bother him. He'd read, besides, that somewhere, in an unimaginable country far away, to the east, there was a people who actually regarded it as a delicacy. But wet clothing was quite another thing. As for the fire itself, he'd take the risk. From what he'd seen, he was probably the first human in this valley in 1,000 years, and its towering sides hid it from view for miles. He gathered together some brushwood from the coppice, and after a few moments' experiment, he had managed to start a tiny red glow in a handful of grass. Carefully, he placed it under a prepared tent of twigs, burning himself as his fire immediately flared. It burned well, giving off little smoke, and that was thin and light, immediately whisked into nothingness by the breeze. For the first time since his first sighting of Masyaf, Ezio smiled. Despite the cold, to save time, he took off his clothes to dry them by the fire on rudimentary brushwood frames as the fish cooked and bubbled on a simple spit. Less than an hour later, the fire kicked out and its traces scattered. He felt a certain warmth in his belly and was able soon afterward to don garments which, if not laundry fresh, were warm and sufficiently dried for him to wear comfortably. They would have to finish drying as he wore them. As for his exhaustion, that would have to keep. He'd resisted the desire to sleep by the fire in the pool, a fight as tough as any he'd had on the road, but he was rewarded by a second wind. He felt equal to the task of returning to the castle. He needed his gear. Then he needed to unlock the secrets of the place, if his quest was to mean anything. As he retraced his steps, he noticed, shortly before he reached the cliff he'd climbed, that on the southern side of the valley another pathway led upward along the side of that rock face. Who had hewn these pathways? Men from the dawn of time? Ezio had no leisure to ponder this, but was grateful that this one was there. It rose steeply eastward, back in the direction of Masyaf. Ezio started to climb. After an ascent of some 500 feet, the path ended on a narrow promontory, where a few foundation stones testified to the presence long ago of a lookout tower, where guards would have been able to scan the country around and give the castle advance warning of any approaching army or caravan. Looking eastward and down, the great complex of Masyaf, with its rearing walls and cupolaed towers, spread out beneath him. Ezio focused hard, and his eyes, as keen as an eagle's, began to pick out the details that would help him return. Far below, he discerned a rope bridge across the same chasm formerly spanned by the stone one he had run across. Near it was a guard post. There was no other access to the castle, as far as he could see, from the side he was on, but at the far side of the bridge the way to the castle was relatively clear. The way down to the bridge, on his side, was another matter, an all-but sheer cascade of black rock, enough to daunt the surest-footed ibex, and it was in full view of the guard post on the castle side of the bridge. Ezio looked at the sun. It was just past its zenith. He calculated it would take 4 to 5 hours to reach the castle. He needed to be inside before darkness fell. He clambered down from the promontory and began his descent, taking it slowly, taking care not to dislodge the jumble of loose rocks in case they tumbled down the mountainside and alerted the Templars guarding the bridge. It was delicate work, but the sun would be setting behind him, and therefore shining in the eyes of any watchers below, and Ezio was grateful for its protection. He'd be down before it set behind the rock face he was on. At last he reached the security and concealment of a large outcrop on level ground not 50 yards from the west side of the bridge. It had grown colder, and the wind was getting up. The bridge, of black tarred rope with narrow wooden slats as its walkway, swung and rattled. As Ezio watched, 2 guards emerged from the post and walked a little way to and fro on their side, but did not venture onto the bridge itself. They were armed with crossbows and swords. The light was dull and flat. It was difficult to judge distances, but the lessening light was to Ezio's advantage, and he blended in easily with his surroundings. Like a shadow, crouching, he made his way closer to the bridge, but there would be no cover once he was on it, and he was unarmed. He paused once more about 10 feet away, watching the guards. They looked cold and bored, Ezio noted to his satisfaction. They would not be alert. Nothing else had changed except that someone had lit a lamp within the post, so he knew there were more than 2 of them. But he needed some kind of weapon. On the climb down, and on his final approach, he had been too preoccupied with not giving his position away to look for something, but he hadn't forgotten that the mountain stone was flint, and there were plenty of loose shards at his feet. They glinted black in the dying light. He selected one with his eyes, a blade-like flake about 12 inches long and 2 wide. He picked it up, and in doing so was too hasty, causing other stones to clatter. He froze. But there was no reaction. The bridge was 30 yards across. He could be halfway easily before the guards noticed him. But he'd have to make a move immediately. He braced himself, stood up, and hurled himself forward. But it wasn't easy going once he was on the bridge. It swayed and creaked alarmingly in the now savage wind, and he had to grab its guide ropes to retain his balance. All that cost time, and by then the guards had seen him. They shouted challenges, which gained him a second or two, but seeing him come on, they unslung their bows, fitted bolts, and fired. As they did so, 3 more guards, bows already primed, came rushing out of the post. The bad light affected their aim, but it was close enough, and Ezio had to duck and dodge. At one point in the middle of the bridge, an old plank snapped under him, and his foot caught, but he managed to pull it free before his leg sank through the gap. Then he would have been done for. As it was, he was lucky to be able to avoid more than a grazing shot as a bolt caressed his neck, ripping through the back of his hood. He could feel its heat on his skin. They'd stopped firing, and were doing something else. Ezio strained to see. Winches! They had plenty of slack rope on the winches, and they were preparing to let it go, let it spin out as soon as they unlocked the winches. They could haul the bridge up again after they'd tumbled him into the gulf below. Merda, Ezio thought, half running, half stumbling forward. Twice in one day? With 5 yards to go, he threw himself into the air as the bridge fell away beneath him, sailing forward and landing on one guard, knocking another flat, plunging the flint blade into the first man's neck, and trying to bring it out again fast, but it broke off where it must have snagged on bone. Then, finding his feet, spinning around as he hauled the second guard, not yet recovered, roughly toward him, and swiftly drawing the man's own sword, he pulled it back and ran him through with it. The other 3 had abandoned their bows and drawn their own swords, penning him in with his back to the precipice. Ezio thought fast. He'd seen no other men around. No one had gone to raise the alarm. He'd have to finish these 3, then get into the castle before anything was discovered. But the men were big, and they hadn't been on guard. They were fresh and rested. Ezio hefted the sword in his hand. He looked from one face to the other, but what was it he saw in their eyes? Fear? Was it fear? "You assassin dog!" one of them spat, though his voice all but trembled. "You must be in league with the devil!" "If the devil is anywhere, he's with you," snarled Ezio, throwing himself forward, knowing that he could take advantage of their fear that he was in some way filled with a supernatural force. "Se solo." They closed then, shouting oaths so loudly that Ezio had to make haste to cut them down, to silence them. Their blows were wild and panicky, and the job was quickly done. He dragged the bodies into the guard post, but there was no time to haul the bridge back up. Besides, that was an impossible job for a man alone. Briefly, he considered changing clothes with one of the guards, but that might have wasted precious time, and the gathering darkness was on his side. Ezio started up the path leading to the castle, grateful for the shadows that had begun to gather at its sides. He reached the foot of its walls on its blind side, unmolested. The sun had all but set, only a red glow showing behind the distant cliffs and mountains to the west. It was cold, and the wind insistent. The castle, old as it was, had weathered stones, and they afforded enough handholds and footholds for a climber who knew what he was doing. Ezio, keeping in mind a picture of the plan of the fortress, which he had studied in Rome, drew on the last reserves of his energy, and began the ascent. 100 feet, he calculated, and he'd be within the outer sanctum. After that, he knew where the connecting gates that led to the inner fortifications, the towers, and the keep were. The climb was harder than he'd thought. His arms and legs ached, and he wished he had some kind of implement that would help extend his reach, one that could grip the holds inflexibly, extending the power of his hands. But he willed himself upward, and as the last embers of sunset died behind the black ramparts of mountain, giving way to the first pale stars, Ezio dropped onto a walkway that ran a few feet below the crenellations of the outer wall. 50 yards on either side of him were watchtowers, but the guards in them were looking out and down. There was a commotion, dimly heard, from the direction of the guardhouse by the bridge. He raised his eyes to the keep tower. They would have stowed his kit, his precious saddlebags with his weapons, in the secure cellar storeroom below it. He dropped from the walkway to the ground, always keeping to the shadows. He bore left, toward where he knew the gate giving access to the keep lay. 12. Soft-footed as a puma, and ever seeking the darkest routes, Ezio reached his goal without further confrontations. Just as well, for the last thing he wanted was another noisy fight. If they found him again, they wouldn't let him linger or give him the ghost of a chance of escape. They'd kill him on the spot, skewer him like a rat. And there were few guards about. All he'd seen were those on the battlements. They must all be out, looking for him in the pale, uncertain light afforded by the myriad stars, and the skirmish at the guard post would have made them redouble their efforts, for that had given them proof beyond doubt that he was not dead. There were 2 other Templar guards sitting at a rough wooden table near the entrance to the cellar storeroom, but on the table was a large pewter jug of what looked like red wine and 2 wooden beakers, and the guards both had their heads and arms on the table. They were snoring. Ezio approached with extreme caution, having seen the ring of keys hanging at the side of one of the men. He had not forgotten the pickpocketing skills which the assassin Madame Paola had taught him as a young man in Florence. Very carefully, trying to keep the keys from jangling, for the slightest sound which might awaken the men could spell his doom, he lifted the ring and, with his other hand, awkwardly untied the leather thong that attached it to the man's belt. At one point the loosening knot snagged and stuck, and in Ezio's efforts to free it, he tugged too hard, and the man stirred. Ezio became a statue, watching vigilantly, both his hands engaged and unable to make a move for either guard's weapon. But the man merely snuffled and went on sleeping, creasing his brow uncomfortably, perhaps at some dream. At last the key-ring was in Ezio's hands, and he crept stealthily down the torch-lit aisle beyond the guards, looking at the heavy iron-clad wooden doors which ran along either side. He had to work fast, but it was a long job, checking which key on the big steel ring fitted into what lock, and at the same time checking that the keys didn't make any noise as he manipulated them. But at the 5th door he struck lucky. It opened into a veritable armory, weapons of various sorts stacked neatly on wooden shelves that ran the length of the walls. He'd taken a torch from its sconce near the door, and by its light he had soon found his bags. A quick inventory indicated that nothing seemed to have been taken, or even, as far as he could see, touched. He breathed a sigh of relief, because these were the last things he wanted the Templars to get their hands on. The Templars had some good minds working for them, and it would have been disastrous if they'd been able to copy the hidden blades. He gave them a brief inspection. He'd travelled with only what he considered to be his essential gear, and he found, after double-checking, that everything he'd brought with him was definitely in place. He buckled on the scimitar, drawing it to make sure its blade was still keen, then slid it into its scabbard, slamming it firmly home. He strapped the bracer to his left arm and the unbroken hidden blade to his left wrist. The broken blade and its harness he stowed in the bags. He wasn't going to leave that for the Templars, even in its current state, and there was always the chance that he'd be able to get it repaired. But he'd crossed that bridge when he came to it. He stored the spring-loaded pistol with its ammunition in the bags, and taking as much time as he dared, took out his parachute and checked that it hadn't been damaged. The parachute was new, an invention of Leonardo's that he hadn't used in action yet, but the practice runs he'd made with it had more than proved its potential. He folded the tent-like structure up neatly and returned it to the rest of his kit, slinging the bags over his shoulder and strapping them securely, and made his way back the way he'd come, past the still-sleeping guards. Once outside, he started to climb. He located a secluded vantage point on a high turret of the keep. He'd selected the place because it overlooked Masyaf's rear garden, under which, if his research on the castle plans had been correct, the Templars would be concentrating their efforts to locate the library of the great assassin mentor Altaïr, who'd ruled the Brotherhood from here 3 centuries ago. The legendary Library of the Assassins, and the source of all their knowledge and power, if his father's letter was to be believed. Ezio had no doubt at all that nothing less than a search for it would explain the Templars' presence in the castle. On the edge of the turret's outer wall, looking down at the garden, was the large stone statue of an eagle, wings folded, but so lifelike that it appeared to be about to take flight and swoop down on some unsuspecting prey. With his hands he tested the statue. For all its weight, it rocked very slightly when he applied pressure to it. Perfect. Ezio took up his position by the eagle and prepared to settle down for the rest of the night, knowing nothing would happen before dawn, and realizing that if he did not take that opportunity to rest, he would not be able to act with efficiency when the moment came. The Templars might have taken him for some kind of demi-devil, but he knew only too well that he was just a man, like any other. But before he rested, a sudden doubt assailed him, and he scanned the garden below. There was no sign of any excavations. Could it be that he was mistaken? Drawing on the lessons he had learned and the powers he had developed in training, he focused his eyes so that they assumed the power of an eagle's and examined the ground beneath him minutely. By concentrating hard, he was at last able to discern a dull glow emanating from a section of mosaic flooring in a once ornamental, now overgrown bower immediately beneath. Satisfied, he smiled and relaxed. The mosaic depicted an image of the goddess Minerva. The sun had scarcely brushed the battlements to the east when Ezio, refreshed by his short sleep and alert, crouched by the stone eagle, knowing that the moment had come. He also knew that he had to act fast. Every moment he spent there increased the risk of detection. The Templars would not have given up on him yet, and they would be fired up with hatred. His escape, when they had him in the very grip of death, would have left them howling for vengeance. Ezio gauged distances and angles, and when he was satisfied, he placed his boot against the stone eagle and gave the statue a good, hard push. It rocked on its plinth and fell out and away over the parapet, tumbling end over end toward the mosaic floor far below. Ezio barely watched it for a second to verify its course before he threw himself into the air after it, executing a leap of faith. It was some time since he had performed one, and now the old exhilaration returned. Down they fell, the eagle first, Ezio plummeting in the same trajectory 15 feet above it, toward what looked like very solid ground. Ezio didn't have time to pray that he hadn't made a mistake. If he had, the time for praying, for everything, would soon be over. The eagle landed first, in the center of the mosaic. For a split second it seemed as if the eagle had smashed to pieces, but it was the mosaic that had shattered, revealing beneath it a large aperture reaching down into the earth, through which the eagle and Ezio fell. He was caught immediately on a chute that travelled deeper into the ground at an angle of some 45 degrees, and he slid down it feet first, steering himself with his arms, hearing the stone eagle thundering its way ahead of him, until, with a mighty splash, it tumbled into a large subterranean pool. Ezio followed. When he surfaced, he could see that the pool was in the middle of a great antechamber of some kind, an antechamber because its architectural focus was a door of dark green stone, polished smooth by time. Ezio was not alone. A party of Templars on the granite embankment of the lake near the door had turned at the sight and sound of the crashing intrusion and were waiting for him, yelling, swords at the ready. With them was a man in workman's clothes, a dusty canvas apron wrapped round his waist, and a leather tool bag on his belt, a stonemason by the look of him. A hammer and a large stone chisel hung in his hands as he watched, mouth agape. Ezio hauled himself up onto the embankment as Templar guards hurried forward to rain blows down on him, but he fended them off long enough to get to his feet. Then he braced himself and faced them. He sensed their fear again and took advantage of their momentary hesitation to attack first. He drew his scimitar firmly with his right hand and unleashed the hidden blade beneath his left. In 2 swift strokes to right and left, he brought the nearest men down. The others circled just out of reach, taking turns to make sudden stabs at him like striking vipers, hoping to disorient him. But their efforts weren't sufficiently concerted. Ezio managed to drive his shoulder against one, pitching him into the pool. He sank almost immediately, its black waters cutting off his anguished cry for help. Swinging round and keeping low, Ezio hurled a 4th man over his back onto the granite. His helmet flew off and his skull cracked with a noise like a gunshot on the diamond-hard stone. The surviving 5th man, a Templar corporal, barked a desperate order to the workman, but the workman did nothing, too petrified to move. Then, seeing Ezio turn on him, the corporal backed away, his mouth slavering, until the wall behind him arrested his retreat. Ezio approached, intending merely to knock the Templar unconscious, but then the corporal, who'd been waiting for his moment, struck a treacherous dagger blow toward Ezio's groin. Ezio sidestepped and seized the man by the shoulder, near the throat. "I would have spared you, friend, but you give me no choice." With one swift stroke of his razor-sharp scimitar, Ezio severed the man's head from his body. "Requiescat in pace," he said softly. Then he turned to the stonemason. 13. The man was about Ezio's age, but running to fat and not in the greatest shape. At the moment he was trembling like an outsize aspen. "Don't kill me, sir," the man pleaded, cowering. "I'm just a working man, that's all. Just some poor nobody with a family to look after." "Got a name?" "Adad, sir." "What kind of work is it you do for these people?" Ezio stood to wipe his blades on the tunic of the dead corporal and sheathed them. Adad relaxed a fraction. He was still holding his hammer and chisel, and Ezio had kept a careful eye on them, but the stonemason seemed to have forgotten they were in his hands. "Digging, mostly. Wretched hard work it is, too, sir. It's taken me a year just to find this chamber alone." Adad scanned Ezio's face, but if he'd been looking for sympathy, he hadn't found it. After a moment's silence, he went on, "For the past 3 months I've been trying to break through this door." Ezio turned away from the man and examined the door himself. "You haven't made much progress," he commented. "I haven't made a dent. The stone is harder than steel." Ezio ran a hand across the glass-smooth stone. The seriousness of his expression deepened. "I doubt if you ever will. This door guards objects more valuable than all the gold in the world." Now that the menace of death was past, the man's eyes gleamed involuntarily. "Ah, do you mean gemstones?" Ezio regarded him mockingly. Then he turned his gaze to the door and examined it closely. "There are keyholes here, 5 of them. Where are the keys?" "They tell me little, but I know the Templars found one beneath the Ottoman Sultan's palace. As for the others, I suppose their little book will tell them." Ezio looked at him sharply. "Sultan Bayezid's palace? And what is this book?" The mason shrugged. "A journal of some kind, I think. That ugly captain, the one with the scarred face, he carries it with him wherever he goes." Ezio's eyes narrowed. He thought fast. Then he appeared to relax, and taking a small linen pouch from his tunic, he tossed it to Adad. It jingled as the man caught it. "Go home," said Ezio. "Find other work, with honest men." Haddad looked pleased, then doubtful.
"You don't know how much I'd like to. I'd love to leave this place, but these men, they will murder me if I try."
Ezio turned slightly, peering back up the chute behind him. A thin ray of light came down it. He turned back to the mason. "Pack your tools," he said. "You will have nothing to fear now." 14. Sticking to the less frequented stairways and corridors of the castle, Ezio regained the high battlements unseen, his breath pluming in the cold air. He made his way round them to a point that overlooked the village of Masyaf, crouching in the castle's shadow. He knew there would be no way of leaving the castle by either of its heavily guarded gates, but he had to track down the scarred, shaven-headed captain. He guessed that the man would be outside, supervising the search for the escaped assassin. Templars would be scouring the countryside, which explained the relative absence of men within the confines of the fortress. In any case, Ezio knew that the next step in his mission lay beyond Masyaf's walls, but first he had to leave the place. Once he had a clear view of the village, he could see that Templar guards were making their rounds of it, interrogating its inhabitants. Making sure that the sun was at his back, obscuring any clear view of him from below, he unstrapped his bags and took out the parachute, unfolding it and erecting it with as much speed as care would allow.